haven't seen that in the literature at all, you know, where you have chronic losses constantly of relatives and community members because of our elevated mortality rates and high accidental death rates and alcoholism rates and all kinds of diseases and suicides and things like that. And then you have other deaths on top of that. So that really hasn't been addressed. So historical unresolved grief includes all of these things, but also preoccupation or, you know, thinking a lot about thoughts of our ancestors who were lost in massacres, our loyalty to ancestors, focusing on their suffering. And some people report dreams and things with content from like the 1800s, so that it's as if we're living in the past and the present at the same time, which is something that actually Judith Kestenberg was a Jewish Holocaust therapist identified, and she called that transposition, because she observed that with Holocaust survivors, that they, and children of Holocaust survivors, that they kind of lived in the past and the present at the same time. And also in terms of native sense of time, we don't have this kind of linear sense of time and traditionally. So you can be in the past and the present at the same time. Everything is fluid. If you're healing the present, you're healing the past and the future. So, so that's another thing that's unique, I think, for a number of different cultures. But, so we may be at risk for complicated or prolonged grief because of all of these deaths, the genocide across generations, frequent death of what is called in the literature attachment figures, or just people that you bonded to and that are close to you, your relatives. And then generational boarding school trauma. And indigenous peoples of Latin America have similar kinds of risk, but in some cases there's a lot of genocide that is currently going on in those countries and countries of origin. I also have a thought that Native grief and mourning is different. I'm trying to check my time and it won't let me, because my sister actually called or texted, so she's with us here in spirit. Native mourning resolution is distinct from European American grief, I think, because our quality of relationships are different. I mean, you can't marry your fifth cousin in traditional Native cultures, you know, because those are still your relatives. Your first cousins in the dominant paradigm are your siblings, are your brothers and sisters, and your aunties and your grandmothers and your uncles or your grandfathers, and you know, it's different. It's a little different in every tribe, but it makes everything closer. So it means that we're always losing relatives, and these losses are felt like a close relative. And in many tribes, your hair is cut when you lose someone, and that was like losing a part of the self, and the hair is sacred, and there's lots of, you know, different tribes that do that. But it was also a visible way for people to know that you were in mourning. So it was actually a wonderful thing because people knew who was bereaved, and it was believed that the bereaved were closer to the spirit world and should be treated with gentleness. And in the dominant culture, you're lucky if you get 3 to 5 days off, depending on the relationship. And then you're expected to come back to work and act like, you know, get back to work, get over it, you know, but it's not, it doesn't really work for anybody's grief, you know, that kind of idea. It doesn't give people time to really mourn. And then because we maintain an active relationship with the ancestor spirits, I think that our grief may be different. So we have to decide for ourselves, as Native people, we have to decide what's normal for us in terms of our grief process. And traditionally, we've all had ceremonies and ways of dealing with grief and loss and trauma. But the thing is that we've had such massive trauma, the genocide, it interferes with the normal grief process. And then because of all those massive losses, it's like a deck of cards. You know, if you think of the layering of a stack of cards, so if you think of each card as a trauma or a loss, they just keep being stacked one on top of another before we have time to really heal from them. And let's skip that one. It's just about that Maya genocide survivors, look at both past and present sadness, and 20 years after the genocide, we're still thinking about the losses. And so our relatives south of the border have a lot of those signs and of historical trauma. The historical trauma intervention, historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention, I want to talk a little bit about. It includes audiovisual materials, it includes education about the genocide, boarding school losses, and oppression, and opportunities to process those losses in small groups and in large groups, and a lot of use of audiovisual materials to help people work through that, because our belief is that we store those things in our bodies and in our memories, and it's affecting us, and that's our bias. So we need to talk about some of these things and help people to become aware of them, and then we incorporate traditional culture of experiences and prayers in our work. And basically, we confront the trauma, understand it, release the pain, and then work on transcending the trauma, and I'll say more about that. The first component was really dealing with the genocide, and this is something that Dr. Eva Fogelman, a phrase that she uses, which I like, and she's a Jewish Holocaust therapist and a child of Holocaust survivors herself. She says confrontation with the past, and I think that's a great expression, so I borrowed that expression from her. And this is what I mentioned. I'm going to go to the actual quote, so I'll skip this one. That Native history meets the United Nations Geneva Convention, the 1948 definition on genocide, which is basically the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and includes causing serious bodily or mental harm to group members. So we know that deliberately inflicting life conditions to cause a group's physical destruction. And some of the quotes in history is, like one from General Sherman was, first clear off the buffalo, then clear off the Indian. We must act with vindictive earnest against the Sioux, even to their total extermination, men, women, and children. And then the trading smallpox-infected blankets deliberately to tribes to try to wipe out the tribes. And then imposing measures to prevent births within the group. There's been lots of testimonies about sterilization, abuse, even as late as the 1970s. And unfortunately, Native women were not alone in this, but we were particularly targeted. But this also went on with Puerto Rican women, Mexican women, and women with disabilities. There was an era that this was actually quite common, and in some cases, poor women. So there's information about that. I don't have any citations at this point to share, but there's information about that if you do a little research on that. And then forcibly transferring children to another group, which is the boarding schools and the adoption out of Native children. This is a quote from, or paraphrase from a U.S. Senate miscellaneous document in 1871, which was basically the act of Congress that decided that deemed that no more treaties should be signed. And Dr. Helen Tanner, who was a historian at the Newberry Library in Chicago and at the Darcy McNichol Center for the History of the American Indian, I had an opportunity to meet her, and she gave me a document that she had to give to the U.S. Supreme Court for the Black Hills land claim case. And she chronicled the history of the United States dealing with the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Nation. And what she said in that document, and she's a non-Native woman, a white historian, and she said that the U.S. government never intended for the long-term survival of the Lakota or other Native people, but they moved to negotiating treaties because we were formidable opponents, and it became too expensive for the government, who was embroiled in the Civil War, to continue their policy of extermination. So this is why treaties were, in her view,